Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. Do you find yourself in bed at night replaying the day and wishing for a do-over? Do you ever ruminate over mistakes you made? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
It's easy to get caught up worrying about your fears and your own shortcomings. Dr. Samantha Boardman says positive psychology offers a better approach.
This is not self-help, and there are no rainbows or unicorns in positive psychology. It's all science-backed. And, as a psychiatrist and somebody coming from the medical field, it was really important for me that this be validated, that there be data behind everything we're talking about today.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, learn how positive psychology might help you gain more resilience.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, the Mediterranean diet is in the news again because of its benefits for the brain. Most people think of a diet rich in fruits, vegetables, nuts, beans, olive oil, and fish as being good for the heart. New data presented at the Alzheimer's Association International Conference this week suggests that the same diet may reduce cognitive impairment as people age. Roughly 6,000 older Americans participating in the Health and Retirement Study were tested for cognitive function. Their diets had also been recorded and analyzed. Those who stuck closely to a Mediterranean-type diet or a MIND diet were 35% more likely to do well on the mental tests. The MIND diet combines features of the Mediterranean diet with the DASH diet and stands for Mediterranean-Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. Such plant-based diets have been shown in other studies to reduce the likelihood of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and dementia.
The MIND diet was the focus of another study presented at the conference. Scientists at Wake Forest School of Medicine collected data from more than 7,000 older women for nearly 10 years. Those whose diets most closely resembled a MIND diet with little or no red meat, saturated fat, or fried foods were 34% less likely to develop dementia during the decade.
Another diet that's gotten far less attention is the traditional Nordic diet. Scientists at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden reported on more than 2,000 volunteers who were tracked for 6 years. Individuals who followed the Nordic prudent dietary pattern had a lower risk of dementia than those who ate a diet that included processed foods and sweets. The Nordic diet includes fish, non-root vegetables, apples, pears, peaches, and tea. It was at least as good as the MIND and Mediterranean diets in preventing dementia.
Researchers at the Alzheimer's Association conference also reported on the impact of sleep on brain function. They found an association between sleep apnea and higher levels of beta-amyloid plaque in the brain. People with sleep disturbances had more plaque than those who usually sleep soundly.
Many people assume that artificial sweeteners are a good way to cut calories and lose weight. A new meta-analysis published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal found that assumption might be misplaced. The investigators examined data from 7 randomized controlled trials and 30 cohort studies with a total of more than 400,000 participants. Sugar substitutes had no consistent impact on weight in the clinical trials. In the epidemiological studies, with median follow-up of 10 years, people who consumed artificial sweeteners actually gained weight. The scientists conclude observational data suggests that routine consumption of non-nutritive sweeteners may be associated with a long-term increase in BMI and elevated risk of cardiometabolic disease.
Low levels of vitamin D have been associated with greater susceptibility to upper respiratory tract infections. A new Canadian study published in JAMA compared high-dose vitamin D supplements to standard supplementation during the winter. Approximately 700 children were randomized to receive either 400 IUs of liquid vitamin D3 or 2,000 IUs of vitamin D3. Neither the parents nor the investigators knew which children had received which dose. Although there was a significant difference in vitamin D blood levels between the two groups, there were no differences in the number of infections. In both groups, youngsters had an average of 1 laboratory-confirmed infection and 2 parent-reported infections. According to the investigators, these findings don't support the routine use of high-dose vitamin D supplementation in children for the prevention of viral upper respiratory tract infections.
Antibiotics are normally used to treat infections, but some psychiatrists are now testing the antibiotic minocycline as an add-on therapy for major depression. A small study in Australia compared 200 milligrams of minocycline to placebo in addition to an antidepressant for 3 months. The results were promising, though not conclusive. The investigators noted improvement in quality of life in the patients on minocycline. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. If we were to meet in the supermarket or on the street, I'd probably say, "Hi, how are you?" And most likely you would say, "Fine," whether that was true or not.
If you see a therapist, on the other hand, the question, "How are you?" might trigger a list of challenges with family, friends, or coworkers. You might spend the rest of the time focusing on your problems.
But what if the therapist helped you focus on your strengths instead of your difficulties? That's the premise behind Dr. Samantha Boardman's approach. She's a clinical instructor in psychiatry and an attending psychiatrist at Weill Cornell Medical College.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Samantha Boardman.
Thank you, Joe and Terry. I'm thrilled to be here.
Dr. Boardman, we are delighted to be talking with you today about positive psychology. We're going to ask you to tell us what in the world that is. But first, can you tell us how you got interested in it?
I was fired by a patient one day, a patient who I thought I was making headway with, and it was a depressed woman, a mother of 3, and she would come to see me every week. I'd prescribed medication for her, an antidepressant, and she had refused to take it. But we were sort of doing talk therapy and some CBT, cognitive-based therapy, and one day she just came in and said, "You know what, Dr. Boardman, I hate coming here. All we do is talk about what's wrong with me, and I'm sick of it, and I'm not coming back." And it was this wake-up call for me at the time that she was right. All we did was talk about what was wrong with her. We tried to dial down her misery, to reduce conflict, and I had never thought about focusing on anything else. And I ended up, as a result of this, going back to school to get a degree in positive psychology that was really the opposite of everything I had learned in psychiatry in my training in residency and in medical school. And positive psychology was more about the science of health and wellness and not just the, science of mental illness that I'd been focusing on for so long. And it turns out that the two can really go hand in hand. It's not one or the other. And Martin Seligman, who's really the founder of positive psychology, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, had said that he thought psychology was sort of half-baked and it had only been looking at the negative and, the lessening of misery or sort of turning the volume down. And this was a new way to look at the positive sides of mental health and look at people's strengths, look at wellness, and even help people find strength within their stress and wellness within their illness.
Well, let's get very specific, if you don't mind, Dr. Boardman. So let's say a patient comes into your office and, first, maybe they went to another health professional, perhaps their primary care physician, or maybe even a psychologist, and everybody has been asking them, "So tell us, what's the problem? Why are you here? What's making you unhappy?" And so they say, "Well, I'm not making enough money. My boss is a tyrant. my wife, she's really difficult. She wants a new car and we can't afford it. And the kids, oh my goodness, they're so demanding. And I think one of them is smoking marijuana and it's really got me upset. And, the litany goes on and on and on. After about 15 minutes, the person is really miserable, and you as the therapist are listening and going, oh boy, this person really, really has problems. If that person walked into your office, instead of going through that long litany of problems, how would you deal with him?
Well, full disclosure, I used to just focus on that chief complaint, like what brought you in the office today? And the chief complaint really always was the centerpiece of treatment. I'm having trouble at work. I'm having financial issues. My wife and I just can't get along, something like that. And then everything else would radiate out from that centerpiece, all sort of forms of treatment, some maybe form of medication and some talk therapy, something like that. And since, I've been engaged in positive psychology, I focus much more on building wellness into their lives. And here's an example of that. If they're relationship issues, and even one of the main reasons people come in to see a psychiatrist is a relationship issue. And even if it's not a relationship issue, whatever's going on is probably creating tension in relationships. And one of the classic findings in positive psychology was, how do you celebrate one another? And I used to do some couples therapy when I was in medical school and during my residency in psychiatry. And we were very good at figuring out how to help people fight better. Don't insult your mother-in-law when you're fighting with your husband, or, don't say something mean. Try to avoid using the word always. Stay specific. Something like that would try to get people to fight better, or couples to, be better at fighting and communicating. In positive psychology, one of the best predictors of satisfying relationships you learn is helping people celebrate one another. It's just these little micro moments throughout the course of a day. If your partner says something to you, look up, give them your full attention, listen, doing these little kind things for one another, be it, bringing them some coffee. If they tell you they're reading an interesting article in the newspaper, look up and listen rather than staying on your phone. How are you paying attention to them? How are you celebrating them? If they come home from work and say, hey, guess what happened today? You say 3 words, tell me more. Rather than like, guess what happened to me? It's sort of going back. And so that building of a connection rather than lessening of a conflict is one thing I would really focus on with patients. Also trying to, somehow increase the positive emotions they have through the day, which usually involve other people, engaging with other people in some way, getting them to do the opposite of something that's making them, our tendency, I think, when we're stressed and anxious or overwhelmed, is to withdraw from ourselves and from others, and to get lazy and to make bad choices around what we eat, or stay up late at night watching television or the news, and not exercise and withdraw from that. So getting people to engage actively in making an exercise plan, asking them to track how they feel before and after, and so they can really see the results of how they're feeling after just a walk in the park. Or even one way to do it is to get them with a friend to say, okay, at 6 a.m. or 6:30 a.m, you and your friend are going to go. So that if you don't show up downstairs, your friend is waiting for you down there. And to add some more of these positive moments back into their lives, because even though, it's the boulders we assume that are going to sort of get us, it ultimately is, I think it's a Muhammad Ali quote, the pebbles in the shoe that take us down. And so you can get these micro moments, these interactions, these little decisions on a daily basis. You can make these incremental changes in their life that sort of outweigh the bad. And it's old research from the 80s. They used to talk about hassles versus uplifts in your day. And if you could try to have more uplifts to hassles, that ratio, that, you would, hopefully have a better day. And I work a lot on the uplifts.
Now, you mentioned that that's old research. Is there more recent research that corroborates that?
Oh, absolutely. From Martin Seligman. I just like the words uplift and hassle, and I think people can really relate to them. But Martin Seligman's work, he thinks that depression is, maybe instead of just being the negative of, a mood or the sort of happiness, that he thinks there are 5 factors that really count. If you build these, you can counter depression. And he uses the acronym PERMA, P-E-R-M-A, and the P stands for positive emotion. There's little interactions, humor, anything that sort of has uplifting, anything that would lift your mood. And then E stands for engagement, those flow moments when you're playing tennis or you're working very hard on something, when you're sort of one with the music. Whatever you're doing, you're very engaged in it. R stands for relationships, that you have support, that you feel loved and you love and you're connected to others. M stands for a sense of meaning in your life, that you're doing something that is sort of beyond yourself. There's some sense of purpose, that you're adding value that transcends you. And A is a sense of accomplishment and achievement, that you are sort of moving forward and building and mastering or doing something that grows upon itself. And I think those 5 elements, if you can try to bolster those, it's one of the best ways we can combat depression.
One of the things you mentioned in the moment, or in the zone, as I like to call it, it's a very special thing that happens, and you sometimes see it with really great athletes. I think of the tennis players, because that's my particular sport, but the Williams sisters, and just watching them play is such a joy. And I think that time almost sort of stands still, not just for the people who are watching, but for the people who are in the zone. And that's true whether you're a diver or whether you're a quarterback or whether you're a tennis player. Could you tell us a little bit about that process, what it means to be in the moment, in the zone?
Absolutely. And that's Mahai Csikszentmihalyi's research. And he used to call it flow, these flow moments. And, flow is available to all of us. And there is seemingly a link between flow or in the moment sort of experiences and well-being. And it's when you do feel one with the music, and athletes are an obvious example, a Michael Phelps swimming in the pool, but, obvious other examples might be a musician, somebody really in it who's playing and they're almost in another world, or a chess player. But all of us have these flow moments available to us. And I'm so glad you brought this up, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot. Is I think with the use of technology and our devices nonstop in our lives and interrupting us, that we have fewer flow moments. And I have one patient who had told me that why she loves going to spinning class is because it's the only time in her day where she's not looking at her phone and she is like her head and her body are in the same place. Like she doesn't even have time to think. It's just all happening at once. And maybe for you that's tennis, but I think we actually have to deliberately seek flow moments in our lives. And another example, I think, of those flow moments is when we're engaged in a hobby. Something that you just do that is for the pure pleasure of it. It's just, you're doing it. It's the process, not the destination, that you're engaging in it. And I think fewer and fewer people have hobbies these days because they're either working or they're like working out or they're online. And I'm trying to bring back the hobby and actually prescribe hobbies for patients, and even things like knitting or sewing. And you can even see these flow moments in almost mundane house activities of, vacuuming or doing the dishes or making beds. You can really get into it, but you have to put your phone down, and it's almost a meditative moment where you're doing something that you're so engaged in and you're not distracted by anything. And oftentimes, probably in tennis with you, you're sort of pushing yourself a little bit to the brink. So you're sort of always like pushing a little bit of a boundary.
You're listening to Dr. Samantha Boardman, clinical instructor in psychiatry and an attending psychiatrist at Weill Cornell Medical College. Her website is positiveprescription.com.
After the break, we'll find out how positive psychology can help against anxiety.
Can a half-empty type of person change and adopt a half-full perspective?
Dr. Boardman likes to help her patients build on their strengths.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, Makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339. Online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1087. That number again, 800-732-2334. You can also download the podcast for free from iTunes.
Our topic today is positive psychology. How do you deal with adversity? Do you become anxious when faced with deadlines or when things don't work out according to plan? Do you find yourself ruminating about how things could have gone differently or beating yourself up for what you might have done wrong?
To help us better understand how positive psychology could make a difference for people, we're talking to Dr. Samantha Boardman. She's a clinical instructor in psychiatry and an attending psychiatrist at Weill Cornell Medical College. Her website is positiveprescription.com. She also has an email newsletter called The Weekly Dose.
Dr. Boardman, I wonder if you could share with us an example of a time when your approach to positive psychology made a difference in somebody's life.
Absolutely. I think a number of cases, but one specifically comes to mind. I had a 50-year-old man who came in very depressed, having trouble paying attention, irritable with his wife, and he'd had a knee replacement a few months earlier, and he was just in the doldrums. And on speaking to him, in my old self would have immediately prescribed an antidepressant for him, but on speaking to him, he used to run all the time, and running was a passion for him. He would run a couple miles a day. And it seemed that he was really self-medicating with his running. He might have had some attentional issues and some, mild depression, and that running really helped him feel better. And he couldn't run anymore, and he had stopped running, and I think that had really contributed to the picture that I was seeing. So we got him in the pool and, got him swimming laps. He joined a swimming pool in the Upper East Side, and it made such a difference. And he, really using his own body in his own way and recognizing that he'd maybe been self-medicating a lot with his running in his life, found that swimming, could get his head back to, and get him back to himself. And that was a really, I think, meaningful example of an intervention that positive psychology really informed my thinking about.
Can you share with us a story about anxiety? Because, I suspect that there are so many people in this country who are feeling anxious. I mean, put aside politics, there are economic issues that make people feel nervous, job issues, family issues, where people are just feeling tense, on edge all the time. Maybe not depressed, but just feeling wound up and wired. And the idea of relaxing is almost impossible. You mentioned, smartphones, tablets, computers. I mean, we're so connected, it's almost impossible not to feel anxious because somebody's making a demand on us, almost every other minute. How have you helped people deal with that kind of pressure and anxiety?
Well, I think sometimes reframing anxiety can really, really help. And one thing I never learned in medical school was that cognitive reappraisal. If you were a fly on the wall, or what advice would you give to a friend at this moment? And one example of just, having tremendous anxiety, I remember a patient who had to perform in front, or just had to speak in front of a large group of people every week. He had been promoted, which was great, but then he had this anxiety the night before he had to speak to his whole team, and he would be consumed by it. And he said, the worst thing would happen. My, heart would start racing. I couldn't breathe. I felt my palms get all sweaty. My knees get weak. I felt like I was going to be sick. And one day he was watching a TV show with, I think it was Jay Leno interviewing a rock star. And he's asking the rock star, tell me, how does it feel when you're about to get up in front of 15,000 people and sing? And the rock star replied, oh, it's just the best feeling. It's all this my heart starts racing. I feel like I can't breathe. I get these beads of sweat on my forehead and my palms get all, clammy and I feel these butterflies in my stomach, and it's my body telling me I'm ready to rock. And so they're kind of physiologically having the same experience, but it's the interpretation that's different. So for him, it was this ability to reinterpret and sort of use positive psychology and to help him, instead of seeing that energy is anxiety or fear or stress, to actually see it as energy and enthusiasm. And it really is a very different, like a different lens to look at something through. And another, I think, really effective tool for a lot of my patients is what Marty Seligman had, I think his research about learned optimism was teaching people to rethink challenges or, just a hiccup in their day, and to ask these 3 questions. If you're missing the subway as you get down to the platform and it's pulling away, your one option is to think, this always happens to me. I'm such a loser. I'm going to have such a bad day. Everything sucks. And you're taking it then personally. You're thinking it is pervasive and thinking of it as permanent. So to ask yourself those 3 questions when something does not seem to go your way, those little disappointments, those hassles we were talking about, and, is it personal? Is it permanent? And is it pervasive? And that can just sort of help you press pause and take a step back and think, wait a minute, let me get a little bit more specific. No, this happened. Like maybe I should have gotten here on time earlier. Maybe I should set my alarm earlier for tomorrow morning. And to give yourself a little bit of perspective to make some changes that maybe you can change and to accept some of the things that you can't.
Now, Dr. Boardman, it's awfully hard for some people to change that habit of, when a hassle arises, saying, "Oh, I'm such a loser. I'm incapable of doing anything right." A lot of people have that kind of self-dialogue going on, tearing themselves down. How can they break that habit?
Oh, I think we're so good at, at the end of the day thinking like, oh, what did I not do? I'm such an idiot. Even the way like that self-talk, that we give to ourselves. And certainly, we know that there is this research around helping people like reprogram that. So at the end of the day, instead of just thinking of all the things you didn't do, writing down the things you accomplished, writing down 3 things that you did that day, writing down 3 things you contributed to, writing down 3 things that you're grateful for, to help shift that perspective away from the negative. And it seems that we're sort of hardwired, and a lot of us are really good at, finding fault with ourselves. And if we can help reprogram that, and with these thinking about what we're grateful for, what we're adding value to. Another thing that I know is a wonderful way to help people sort of press pause and be a little bit less negative and hard on themselves is to do something for someone else. And it could be so simple. It could be holding the elevator, handing somebody a Kleenex, just something that's really minor. And the third thing I'd like to mention is the idea in psychiatry that sort of everything happens in your head, like you have to get people to think differently. Well, I think if you get people to do something different, that can also change how they think. So we know if we can get somebody to go outdoors and spend time in some form of nature, be it a park or just outside, if we can get somebody to exercise a little bit, just taking the stairs, something like that can help them maybe look up and see something from a different perspective. So it's not just your head that informs your body. I think your body really does inform your head and help you think a little bit differently.
Dr. Boardman, there are some people who say, well, she's a half full kind of person. And we had a neighbor like that, Grace. I mean, she was an older woman. She'd had a tremendous amount of tragedy in her life. But she was one of those people, when you got within 10 feet of her, you couldn't help but smile because she was such a happy, wonderful, loving person. And despite all of the problems, she just exuded joy. And made you feel happy just being close to her. Then there are the people who are the half-empty people. They just say, well, my life sucks. I see the world as a grim, gloomy place, and I just don't know how to think of it any other way. Are we just sort of programmed with that, or something we learn from our parents or the people around us? I mean, how do we change from being a half empty to a half full kind of person? Is it even possible?
Oh, no, absolutely. And there definitely seems to be a genetic component to some of that. But from Seligman's work, it does seem that, learned helplessness was, something in the 60s that happened. That was the model of helplessness and depression. Those two were linked. But he revisited that in the 2000s and really showed that you could teach optimism. And I don't think, you'd ever have like a sunny, personality all the time if somebody was so drastically that Debbie Downer, oh no, here we go again. But we can just sort of help people re-look at a situation, and getting them to, encouraging them to do something for somebody else is, I think, a wonderful intervention. And those 3 Ps that, are you taking it personally, are you thinking of it as permanent, and as pervasive, can help people. And thirdly, looking at, we don't really value Pollyanna-like optimism, like, oh, it's so great, my, husband's left me, or I've just lost my job, or, that type of thing. But looking at realistic optimism, because realistic optimism seems to be linked with resilience and what they also called post-traumatic growth, like people who've had something, really difficult happen to them, and instead of having post-traumatic stress disorder, they have post-traumatic growth. They change for the better. And looking at POWs, people who've had really difficult times, the ones who are able to accept the reality of a situation, but also have some hopefulness for the future. And looking at that as a sort of, for me, I try to ask my patients as well to think of what's a future orientation here? Like, how can we, because I think people who are very pessimistic have a distortion of the future. They only see the dark scenario. And, maybe they're right, but if you're thinking of sort of having a flashlight, if you walk into a room and you only point a dark room and you only point the flashlight in the corner, you'll probably see the cockroaches. But what if you point it up on the wall and there might be a painting? Or what if you point it, on the wall and there's a window outside? And so encouraging them to see the larger spectrum, to think of it as a buffet then to choose from. And even for younger people, I often say, be a detective here. Like, what's your inner Sherlock Holmes? Like, yes, this is possible, and you've got the worst case scenario, and that's horrible, and everyone hates you, and, maybe that's the case. But what if there's another, what else could be the case here? Another option available to people is encouraging them to take a strength survey. And these are online, and the via character.org, and it's a free survey. And it pops out. It takes about 20 minutes, and there's an adolescent version as well. And it gives you your top 5 strengths. And as we know, we're all really good at being, I'm bad at this and I'm terrible at that. But this one changes your thinking a little bit, because when you start thinking about, oh, well, one of my top 5 strengths is patience or kindness or appreciation of beauty, something like that. And then asking people to use one of these strengths in a new way. And even with families, they encourage, there's a program in Pennsylvania encouraging people to do this with their families or in schools. And you could strength spot in other people. Say, oh, I just spotted you using your strength of love, or I just spotted you using your strength of kindness. And it just is a wonderful way to reprogram all that negative sort of language even that we're all so good at.
That does sound interesting. And you said this is online?
Yes. Yeah. It's, I think, the via character.org, VIA, and then CHARACTER.org.
Oh, great.
And it's a survey. It's great.
Thank you. Dr. Boardman, I have heard some people make the pushback to the idea of positive psychology by saying, well, this is just new dressing for a really old idea that was discredited back in the day. And so they're thinking about Dr. Norman Vincent Peale's book, The Power of Positive Thinking, published in 1952. It was an extremely popular book at the time, kind of a take on religion as a source of hope. There is, I trust you'll be able to tell us why positive psychology is different from Norman Vincent Peale's approach.
Yes, and I think maybe there were some elements even of positive psychology, even way before then, and maybe Norman Vincent Peale, somebody could connect a line to positive psychology, but there's a lot of differences here. I mean, this is not self-help, and there are no rainbows or unicorns in positive psychology. It's all science-backed. And, as a psychiatrist and somebody coming from the medical field, it was really important for me that this be validated, that there be data behind everything we're talking about today. So it's not just a hunch or, oh, this is in some self-help book that I think this will probably work. And, why don't you try, coloring in a rainbow as well? This is, it's based in science. And that said, though, I also think with these interventions that we're talking about in positive psychology of these using your strengths or, even exercise, all these types of things, or the gratitude lists to make at the end of the day, that it's also important to have somebody check in the same way if you prescribe a medication, you need to check in about it. What if some of these interventions might make that specific patient feel worse for some reason? So I think we have to be really responsible about all of this data and use it wisely.
Well, you mentioned the rainbow, and I suspect there are some pessimists who are listening who are going, oh, Pollyanna. She's, there's no pot of gold. There's no rainbow. What's she talking about? How can you make something that's so gloomy and grim and difficult positive? How can you put a smile on my face when I'm feeling so down in the dumps?
Well, first of all, I think the whole idea of the smiley face itself makes me cringe too, and there is no blueprint for happiness. And I think if anybody tells you there is, or that, there's a book that you should buy that's going to make you happy, that you should run in the other direction. But that said, I do think that we can help ourselves in many ways and help one another figure out what can help us feel better in the moment. And sometimes we look to the past to think, oh, well, from my experience, this is what I've always done, and therefore I always do it this way, and to try to think a little bit more flexibly about what we can do. And this notion I want to challenge that happiness comes from within. I think it comes from doing things with and for others, and there's a lot of science behind that. And that it's not just changing how you think, it's really changing what you're going to be doing.
You're listening to Dr. Samantha Boardman, a psychiatrist and clinical instructor of psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College. Her master's is in applied positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. Her website is positiveprescription.com.
I love Dr. Boardman's mention of these 3 Ps. Can you remind me what they were?
Sure. Is it personal? Is it pervasive? Is it permanent?
I think a lot of us, we kind of get into a little bit of a valley and we think, oh, it's all a problem for poor me.
Right, but that's kind of center of the universe syndrome, don't you think?
Absolutely. I love her idea of the strength survey, because we all do have strengths, but sometimes we forget about them.
Exactly. And that website that she talked about, it's viacharacter.org.
Well, we need to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll find out about some positive aspects of stress.
How can you find resilience even when you're under stress?
Emotions can influence the goals we set and what we achieve.
How does Dr. Boardman help her patients come up with a workable plan?
You'll also get her advice to health professionals for dealing with patients in distress.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening to this podcast of The People's Pharmacy. If you like it, why not rate or review it in the iTunes store? We'd appreciate it.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth foot cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel utterly soft and smooth. The number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
To purchase a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1087. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the free podcast from iTunes or from our website. We invite you to consider writing a review.
Today, we're talking with psychiatrist Samantha Boardman about positive psychology. She's a clinical instructor in psychiatry and an attending psychiatrist at Weill Cornell Medical College. Her website is positiveprescription.com, and you'll find a link to it from our website, peoplespharmacy.com. Dr. Boardman also has an email newsletter called The Weekly Dose.
We often hear that stress is killing us. It's probably not possible to avoid stress completely, but maybe we can reframe it. Does positive psychology offer us a different approach to dealing with stress?
Well, yes, some of the stress you might not, is it beyond you and it's killing you, but is there some good stress in your life? Are there things that mastery and challenge require some stress as well? So if you can dissect your stress and also then anticipate and plan ahead and create, one of the, we often hear about that marshmallow study that Walter Mischel did in the 60s, looking at children who were 4 or 5, and he put a marshmallow in front of them, and they were told if they didn't eat that marshmallow, they could have a second one. But if they ate it, that was fine, but then they couldn't have a second one. And they tracked those kids for years afterwards, and the kids who didn't eat the marshmallow and had seemingly greater self-control were the ones who went on to graduate from high school, had fewer drug problems, better relationships, better jobs, and whatnot. And so I think we prize this thing of self-control, and if only you can will it or will something away. But from that research, it actually turned out that the kids who were able to resist the marshmallow, they had other strategies. Some sat on their hands, another one covered their eyes, another one turned their back to it and sang to the wall. So I think there are other strategies available to us, and we just have to expand the repertoire, and we can deploy them. And I think when we're armed with these different strategies, we can, and especially when we're planning ahead in our lives, and I think that's one of the most important things with stress is thinking, okay, well, maybe I don't wake up when my alarm goes off in the morning. Well, what if you put your alarm in the other room and make it so loud that you have to get out of bed then? In some way, that's not a great amount of self-control. That's just planning. So there's so many things that I think we can plan for in some way that can really help minimize some of those daily stressors in our lives. I have one patient who is so stressed out. She's in the fashion world and she has to go and look good in before she gets to work. And it used to take her like an hour in the morning that she'd be late to work to figure out what to wear. And so, she just has this new plan where she just, chooses the outfit the night before, she checks the weather, and it's good to go. And it's just made her mornings so much better. Just these little interventions, I think that planning and thinking ahead can really help minimize the daily stress.
Dr. Boardman, I love the idea of Sherlock Holmes. I'm a big Sherlock Holmes fan. And the idea of using that sort of a strategy for, looking for strengths. This would be especially valuable, I suspect, for teenagers, but perhaps for anyone. Could you go into a little bit more detail about, how we can find our resilience?
Absolutely. I mean, resilience has become a word, I think, that just gets thrown around a lot these days. And it's almost up to mean anything. But what I've become really interested in is this, little r resilience, the daily, how do you have a good enough day and channel your little r resilience? It's not necessarily the recovery from something, some major setback, but the little things that really do sort of bug us. And I think there are really 3 things that come to mind that really can help build that little r resilience and really which becomes big R resilience is how are you connecting to others and what are you doing to, connect and deepen a relationship, even in what we call social snacking, even interacting with the barista at your coffee shop or smiling, having a conversation with a coworker you don't really know that well, something like that. They even say, and maybe it's too awkward in New York City, but if you sit next to somebody on the train, a stranger, and you have a conversation with that person, you'll actually go on to probably have a better day than if you just sat there looking at your phone or reading the newspaper. And maybe that's, grounds to throw somebody in New York into, the loony bin. But actually, speaking to strangers helps us feel better and it helps us trust other people. And I think these connections to the ones we love, but also to strangers really help kind of fortify us. And The next thing I'd like to talk about is, the idea of a good day, I think, is a day that you've learned something, that you've expanded beyond yourself, where you've, used some kind of new skill, you've deepened your knowledge about something, that you feel that you've expanded in some way. And even about, learning something about your partner. And when you sort of think about your partner in a new light, Ellen Langer at Harvard used to say to her couples who would come in, instead of thinking like, oh, here he goes again doing this or that, or I know she's going to do this. And I think we're all really good at sort of predicting, like we know the end of the movie or whatever conversation we're having, especially with the people closest to us. Look for 3 new things about your partner each day. And it's just a mind shift a little bit. And you're sort of being a detective there, like, okay, instead of thinking, oh, here she goes again, like what are 3 new things that you could notice about them? And I promise you they're there. We're just not programmed to look for them. And then the third thing I was just going to say is try to contribute to something. I think that also builds resilience. As we said, connecting, sort of learning something or being curious and contributing to something. And just that thing of adding value, adding to something beyond yourself and doing something for somebody else just in some way that you feel like you've got a sense of purpose. And it might just be buying coffee for the person behind you in line. Like it doesn't have to be some, major thing or volunteering, but it's these simple little ways that I think help build that little R resilience.
Dr. Boardman, we love evidence on the People's Pharmacy, and I'm just wondering if there have ever been any experiments with people to show how their emotions or their, just thinking happy thoughts might impact their outcomes.
Absolutely. And there are studies that really suggest this and show this. And having a sort of positive mindset can really influence, children in simple play tasks, how they are able to complete a project. And also we know that doctors who are happier, their moods are brighter, are better at diagnosing an illness versus those who aren't. And obviously they're nicer to talk to. I think their bedside manner is better as well. So we know that definitely makes a difference. But I think it's important to highlight here that it's not just about sort of thinking positive thoughts, because positive thinking, can just, if you're just sort of Pollyanna style, thinking positive thoughts can sometimes get in the way of being realistic. And that's why I bring up this sort of realistic happiness or realistic optimism. And that you don't want to think, oh, I'm going to, I had a patient who was almost too positive, like, oh, I think I'm going to do great on that math test. I'm going to be fine. And, well, if you don't study that hard, or if you're going to instead on Saturday night when your friends are going out, and you're not going to study, that's not going to help. So Angela Duckworth, who has been working on this, matching the positive outcomes with positive thinking, she calls it, in goal setting, creating WOOP goals, WOOP. So your wish, what's your wish? That might be, I'm going to get an A on my math test. I'm going to lose 5 pounds, something like that. And then the O stands for, okay, what would the outcome of that be? How would you feel then? And then what are the obstacles that are going to get in the way of that, of you doing well with that? And then the fourth part of that plan is then what's your plan? WOOP. So it's a wish, outcome, obstacle, and plan. And so it really helps you get specific about not just thinking positively of something, but, actually thinking through a challenge. And I think it's a really important thing to highlight because it's important to think positively, but also have plans and expectations and anticipations of things that might sort of throw curveballs at you.
That seems pretty important because otherwise you could have someone who say, well, my plan is to win the lottery. That's
yes, exactly.
Not going to work.
No,
well,
and
it's not going to work for most people. It works for one person.
It's not a plan.
Right. But what you're saying, Dr. Boardman, is so intriguing to me because I suspect that relatively few of your colleagues in the mental health field help patients come up with a plan. And I'm wondering how you do that and if you have any examples or stories where you actually were able to accomplish that with a patient who, was feeling stuck.
Absolutely. And, in helping them actually create the plan themselves. So it's not just like, here's, my, suggestion of how you should do something. So, especially we would talk before about strengths and using strengths. So instead of, for example, for a patient who was creating a New Year's resolution, I just, I want to lose weight, that's probably not the best strategy because it's vague, first of all. And secondly, that, there's no plan around that. So instead, what about using one of your strengths as something, instead of trying to do less of something that or kind of to fix a weakness, what about trying to build upon your strength? So that patient also happened to have one of her top strengths was curiosity and also love of beauty. So we made her New Year's resolution then to spend time once a week. We made it really specific. What we called crispified her plan, so that once a week she would either visit an art museum or a gallery with a friend. And she created this whole plan about how she would go around doing it. But then the idea around this too was then when she was sort of doing something with somebody else, she was less distracted and less, she felt sort of fortified and I think whole, and then ended up, as a byproduct of that, felt sort of less binging, which she was eating quite a lot, and felt sort of more fortified and stronger because she was doing something positive. So I think that's an example of where these sort of more positive activities, and once you're putting them into your energy into something good, can really help you navigate your way through your challenges as well.
Dr. Boardman, there are a lot of health professionals who are listening to us. They're primary care providers, maybe nurse practitioners, physician associates, doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists. They probably didn't learn a lot about positive psychology. They're more used to prescribing antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents, sleeping pills, maybe even antipsychotic medications. What would you like them to take away from our interview today going forward as other possibilities of dealing with patients in distress?
I would love to remind them of the many strategies, I think, that are available to us and to our patients that can help fortify them and help them feel strong within their stress. And to engage patients, I think, in their own treatment is extremely helpful. And I recognize how challenging it is to spend time talking to people, especially when you've got 20-minute slots to meet with patients, and you can't underestimate how difficult that is on anybody's practice. But if there's a sense, if you can get to know your patient and know their strengths and help them use their strengths to cultivate some of that, positive emotion in their lives, this engagement, their relationships, a sense of meaning and a sense of achievement or accomplishment, I think you can really help fortify them in some way and create a sense of fulfillment that might counterbalance some of the stress they're experiencing. And I'm not trying to say that, there's never, room for medication, that, that in certain cases, absolutely in every case is really specific. But I just think it's nice to know that there's this smorgasbord to choose from of other interventions and strategies that can be really helpful and engaging for our patients. And it's really satisfying to see patients thrive.
And Dr. Boardman, for our listeners who are not health professionals, what should they take away from our conversation today?
I think that well-being is a verb. It's not something that you have or you don't have. It's something you kind of, work towards. And we know that relationships are a verb. Connecting with other people is a verb. Curiosity, I think, is a verb. And contributing to others is a verb. So just to keep that in mind and to reach out rather than sort of folding in on yourself. And I hope that sense of self-expansion can really help keep your eyes outside and looking outward and forward.
Dr. Samantha Boardman, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you so much for having me. I so enjoyed it, Joe and Terry. Thank you.
You've been listening to Dr. Samantha Boardman, clinical instructor in psychiatry and an attending psychiatrist at Weill Cornell Medical College. Her website is positiveprescription.com. You'll find a link to it from our website. She also has an email newsletter called The Weekly Dose, and it's little short squibs of interesting things.
Now, she talked about the marshmallow study, Terry, where kids had to delay their gratification to get an extra marshmallow. But that was a study that was done in the United States.
There's a long time ago.
A very long time ago. I remember learning about it in psychology class in college. There's a new study out.
Well, Yes, indeed. Researchers have redone the marshmallow study, although they didn't use marshmallows, and it turns out that the response is culturally specific. They redid this study with German children who got either a lollipop or a chocolate bar as their temptation, and Cameroonian kids. And for the Cameroonian kids, the treat was something called a puff puff, which is sort of like a donut. And it turns out that about 70% of the Cameroonian kids were able to just sit there and wait and get their second treat, whereas only about 30%, not even quite 30% of the German kids actually were able to wait. And the researchers think that maybe it has to do with the way they're brought up. The Cameroonian kids are brought up in a pretty strict multi-generational household, and they are expected to do as they're told. So that may have something to do with it.
And having a little extra patience modeled might also help.
Absolutely.
Now, Terry, I love this idea of these strategies that can work. You know, the little resilience, the little R can become big R, big resilience. And there were a couple of ideas there. Connecting to others, social snacking. I love social snacking.
Exactly. And I also like the idea of trying and learn something every day. That's why you listen to public radio, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the idea of contributing to something or someone.
Absolutely. And it doesn't have to be a big contribution, but a contribution makes you feel good, no matter how it makes the other person
feel. Now, what do you think Dr. Boardman meant when she said well-being is a verb?
I think she meant that it's something that you actively engage in, that you're actually trying to do and feel and be better every day.
Well, that's a wonderful message, and I hope we can take it to heart, and we hope you will take it to heart as well. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much for listening to The People's Pharmacy. Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski is the engineer. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Red X Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Extra Care 20 Cream with 20% urea for extra skin protection. 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1087. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
And when you visit our site, you can check out information on prescription drugs, herbal medicines, home remedies, and share your thoughts on today's show. We'd like to know how you use positive psychology in your own life.
At our website, you can also sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. You can listen at your own convenience or share it with a friend. We'd certainly appreciate your rating our podcast at iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you subscribe. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening, and please do join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.
This is an ad by BetterHelp. BetterHelp recently surveyed over 16,000 people and found that while 75% of people believe it's wise to seek support, only 27% of Americans are in therapy, and people stay silent to avoid being judged. BetterHelp has over 10 years of experience matching you with the right therapist. Because we're all better with help. Visit BetterHelp.com/StopTheStigma for their first ever State of Stigma report, the latest in mental health research.